your 3 guiding principles, which I'd never heard in the 90s, which was what always have a beatbox in your dressing room.
This wasn't the 90s. This was for Loaded. These were my rules.
For Loaded. Well,
yeah.
You should have told the staff. We had
I
no
did
idea.
tell you that you were too
I thought you said
excitable.
I thought you always said always have a bottle in your
No,
dressing room.
these were. I can tell you what these are. Joe Strummer said always have a beatbox in the dressing room. So that stayed in my mind. Bill Drummond, who I'd been to Sweden with to try and find ABBA for the Justified Engines movement, the car broke down. And he said, you've always got to just, honestly, just be aware of what the situation is. Understand the limits
of the situation.
And then the third one was Hunter Thompson, be the story, which you excelled at.
That was my guiding principle, yeah. If the story isn't happening, get drunk and make it happen. That was my
But do you know what? I'd never heard this before.
We are proud to be sponsored by On Beer, the only alcohol-free beer scientifically proven to give you a buzz. I drink it and I like the buzz. Support the show, get 15% off and keep me in a job. Search On Beer and use the code MARTIN15. So welcome to Unloaded with me, Martin Deeson, the podcast where we talk to some of the biggest characters from the 1990s. Few characters can be considered bigger, particularly in my life and the life of a generation of young men and women, than this fella, James Brown, founder of Loaded magazine.
I knew I recognised you. We worked together.
We did work together, but we haven't seen each other for 5 years, I'm going to say. I think, something like that. It's strange. Because I've just been reading your book. I never read your book, Animal House. I was very nervous
about it now.
I wasn't.
You had reason to be nervous, but I wasn't going to stitch anyone
I
up.
was terrified. It's like reading a book by your ex-wife.
You threatened to sue us.
I did not threaten to sue. I've never seen anyone in my life.
She did on Twitter. She said she was going to sue me.
I did not.
No, but you've got to realise, I behaved as badly as anyone, so I wasn't going to drop anyone in it.
Yeah, I know, but you've always been quite good at dropping other people in it, if I'm honest. But listen, I'm trying to say something nice, and you're not letting me. Fucking per.
Thank you. Did you enjoy the book?
First of all, the first thing I've got to say, because I just think I've ever said this to you, particularly not recorded, is thank you.
Thank you.
Because if you hadn't given me that job on Loaded and then sent me all over the world to these crazy assignments, and then taken me with you to GQ, my life would have been very different. Probably much better and wealthier, but I would it would not have had so many good stories. So thank you for that. And I kind of want to say probably thank you on behalf of a generation of young men and women, because watching the Loaded documentary really reminded me how central that magazine was to that decade. I
haven't seen it.
You haven't seen Loaded documentary?
And I didn't want to watch it.
Quite wise, actually. Yeah.
No, but I just knew where they were coming from quite early on. And the reason I agreed to do it was the director who approached me had got a BAFTA for doing. He got
for doing
Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
So that was half. That was the main reason. And then Jess, who was one of the
she was very good, the producer. Yeah.
He told me that she'd read the book and loved it, and it was her idea. So he went. Well, I haven't named him, so it's fine. Oh, we have named him. He went off to do something, illegal. And
who did?
The director. And I was left with Jess in the blue posts where the Serge Gainsborough and Jane Birkin are photographed out in Soho. And so I said, I asked her a few questions, a little bit like when we went to GQ and I asked Jonathan Newhouse a few questions, and I thought, okay, she understands what the book is about, because it's not just about the hijinks of what we got up to or the successes. She was really understanding of, kind of the backstory of what was going on through my life in my family at the time. So that was why I agreed to do it. And then he fucked off. And they brought in rampant feminist who mainly did sex documentaries.
Oh, but I thought she did a very good job. It's worth saying that the producer you're talking about, I beg your pardon, she's probably, I don't know, but late 20s. I thought it was incredible how she understood. She probably wasn't.
Jess.
Yeah, Jess probably wasn't born when we launched Loaded, and she totally got her head around it.
Yeah, she was smart.
And I thought she really understood that the whole Loaded magazine, tits and arse, all that stuff came later, and it was forced on us by publishers who wanted us to keep up. I thought they did a really good, sensitive job. And Irving Welsh told me the other day
a lot of people said
that loved it, but you haven't seen it.
Irving
Welsh said you loved it and for the first time felt vindicated, because that's what I felt. I thought after 30 years, you were being taken seriously.
Also,
well, not seriously, but
Later I said to my girlfriend, I wish I got this nice Universal Works jacket and tie. And I said, I wish I'd worn this for the documentary. She said, don't you remember that's what you had on? And they said, can you go for something more casual?
I have no recollection of what you're wearing, although I do know because Adam, the producer, watched it the other day. I was wearing a dark blue shirt like this, and he said, "Have you only got one fucking shirt?"
No, but you know, people don't realise this when you go on television that it's there for life, and what people do know is if you look at a photograph of yourself and you think, "Oh my God, what am I wearing?"
Oh, it's horrible.
So, what's going on with my hair? Everybody has had that experience. Yeah. And so it was partly that as well. I didn't really want to see
it's horrible.
What the jumper and jacket looked like.
Being on TV is horrible because you just look at it and go, God, well, I look at it and go, God, you look so fat.
Yeah, but
what can you do? Not you, me.
I never watch anything I've been on. I'm not bothered. It's like when actors say they don't watch films.
Well, it was quite good, let me tell you.
I enjoyed the interviews.
They bought your book, Animal House, to base it on, right? Because I've just read, James has written a brilliant book called Animal House, which is not just about Loaded. It's got to be said. What's also fascinating, because working with you in the night, I just didn't know all your stories from before Loaded, both the personal stuff and the enemy. I mean, it's incredible stories. Then like that, just the night that you had in Vic Reeves' flat that you were living in, Jim's flat, you had Marquis Smith,
no, it wasn't.
Shane MacGowan, and Nick Cave.
You conflated two things. So when Loaded was being developed, I discovered. I think I can stand up and say I discovered about 4 acts in terms of.
Stop being so shy and
giving them, but giving them their first ever coverage.
Go on,
in a decent paper. So that would be the Charlatans, the band that became the KLF, Bill Drummond and Jimmy Courtney, and Vic Reeves. And Bob calls me a visionary in his book, in his autobiography.
Wow. So
I became good friend. That's 3. I don't know who the other one would be. But the enemy, that was one of the things we did. We all want to champion new bands. And Steve Lamack, who was my colleague there, who I helped get on the paper, he's got an MBE or something now.
Is he?
But people like Steve and his mate Simon and myself and maybe Helen Mead, we were kind of mainly younger than most of the other writers. You want to find the new hot band.
And Stuart Maconie, I saw you say.
Yes, Stuart.
He was a school teacher. Is this right? And you gave him his first job writing for the enemy, and all the kids cheered in assembly.
Yeah.
And then, because I think of him as being the generation above us, because he's quite grown up. You know what I mean? Does Radio 4. Yeah.
Basically, when I became the live reviews editor when I was 21 at the NME, on the desk there was about 40 envelopes that hadn't been opened of submitted stories. And there was one from this guy in Wigan who'd done a review of Edwin Collins from Orange Juice.
Yeah.
And there was one from a woman called Barbara Ellen, who I knew because I'd met her once at the Zigzag. And there were a few others. People that got away that didn't respond because that pile of envelopes had been unanswered for so long. I always think about that, the people that I wrote back to, and they didn't come back.
Well, yeah, I always think that in life.
Stuart and Barbara
sliding doors, isn't it?
Yeah, Stuart and Barbara were both incredibly talented writers. So it was just a case of shepherding them in and like getting the other editors. So like Adrian Thrills running the front section and saying, why don't you get Stuart to interview Andrew Berry, who was Morrissey's hairdresser and a singer in his own right, or why don't we get Barbara to interview? And then like a year later, when our later boss on Loaded, Alan Lewis, who was the editor of the NME, he made me the features editor when I was 22. So at that point, the NME was the most important weekly music paper in the world. There were other titles in England like Record Mirror, Melody Maker, and Sounds. And then in America, there's Rolling Stone and Cream. But NME, if you got on the front of the NME, you'd get your career was rolling. You had momentum. So they made me the features editor at age 22. Like mostly, the staff were in their late 20s, early 30s. Alan must have been about 40. And Alan just said, choose the covers, but make sure
it's mad, really.
Well, at his funeral, Alan, we should, if you're listening to this and you're interested in magazines, there's 2 great editors from the area I've come through in the 70s. One is Nick Logan. And Nick is well celebrated because he built up the NME and he launched Smash Hits and he launched Face and he launched Arena magazine and he launched a couple of others that didn't do so well. But Nick's magazines always look great. So he has a better kind of history because, they do exhibitions. And then the other guy was Alan, and Alan Lewis. he started the first British black music title, predictably for Alan, called Black Music.
That's so. It's worth saying. Alan later became the publisher of Loaded.
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about him. And then he, he championed punk in sounds, and he built sounds up. And then the new wave of British heavy metal emerged, like Def Leppard and
Saxon,
and he created Kerrang. And then he went to run a pub, and then he came back, did number one, and then they moved him to Enemy. So he was actually, in terms of copies sold, he was probably more successful than Nick Logan. But Nick was more seen in fashion and stuff like that. And
well, Nick started his own publishing company. Actually,
and Alan stayed working for others.
Exactly, stayed for IPC. About 100 magazines.
I tried to get them together because I knew both of them, and I'd see both of them years after I wasn't working with Alan. I'd go and see him, or I'd have lunch with Nick, and I'd try to get them together. And then Alan got ill, but at Alan's funeral a couple of years ago, this guy came up to me called Jeff Barton, and he'd been the editor of Sounds after Alan, and he'd been the editor of Kerrang. And in heavy metal circles, he's the guy, in terms of the editor of the magazines. And he came up to me, and he didn't remember that when I was 16. I applied for a job on Sounds that was in the papers, or maybe 17. He interviewed me. I had to come down to London for a day, and he interviewed me. I said, "We've met before, Jeff." He said, "I'm Jeff Barton." I said, "We've met before. You interviewed me when I was at school." And anyway, he said to me about 2 months after Alan took over the Enemy, he said, "Jeff," who was still editing Kerrang, "let's go for a drink." Because Jeff had been his protege then. And he said, "I've got this kid in the office, and he's got something. It was probably a sexually transmitted disease," but that's what he said about me, and I obviously never knew that. And but he was, when you're saying thank you to me for giving you the chance to show your talents in Loaded, Alan was the guy that he made me the features editor, and he stopped them sacking me a few times because I'd punched a few people, and he convinced them. He wanted to give me the Enemy editorship, and then the other people there thought I was too rough still, and too young and wild and immature. So he said, "Okay, do your own magazine," and that's how Loaded came about, out off the back of being asked to apply for the NME job and then not being given it again.
Well, isn't that like? I mean, that to me would be. I mean, obviously, the most obvious talent to be a really good editor is the content of the magazine. Yeah, that's the most obvious one. So when I've looked, that's my second point. Yeah. So when I've looked at Loaded's magazines recently, it is amazing. You open up those early issues, and it's just like 70s TV, comedy, music, crisps,
it's just my life.
Fashion. It's like literally it's like opening the top of your head at that age and looking in it, because you were quite an unusual character. But I think that assembling the team of people, even at the time, I knew that, because we used to talk about that 70s TV
it was a mixture.
Double deckers. Exactly. It wasn't like you got a bunch of indie kids or a bunch of indies and some skate kids or whatever. We were all very, very different. But we gelled amazingly.
That was deliberate, because one of the things, I didn't have any training of any sort. I learned on the job from at Sounds with an editor called Tony Stuart, and then with Alan at the NME, and I learned how you've got to balance the age of the subjects you're featuring, you've got to balance the type of writers, you've got good different personalities are good. So when he said, "Do you want to start your own magazine?" there were people that I knew. So the first employee was Tim Southwell, and it was simply that Tim loved the Jam. And he liked Leeds, who I supported.
Tim was deputy editor and is possibly the most energetic and enthusiastic person I met at the time.
Yeah, he's still
he makes the whole room.
Yeah, so then, but Tim was working for Miss London, the free secretary magazine.
He'd been on Smash Hits before,
and he was freelancing for Smash Hits. And I knew Keanu Reeves then.
Well, I was about to say, that's in your book as well. Just say, that's another thing you sort of thrown away in your book, that you were living in Keanu Reeves' pool house in LA.
No, I wasn't.
You never mentioned this then. It's not like you to not mention
stuff. You've read this. You've conflating two things. The Beastie Boy, Adam Horowitz's mother-in-law, who was Ione Skye's mum, asked me if I wanted to go and live in her beach house because they were moving out. But no, I knew Keanu because I'd met him in a bar in London.
I thought you lived in Keanu Reeves' girlfriend's pool house.
I took him out in London.
It's a big book. I read it quickly.
I could see he was getting a little bit flustered. So I just sent a note over the way saying, "Do you want to go to a really cool music club?" And so he came with me and Murphy Williams, who's on Vogue, and we had a great
Murphy
night.
Williams, who ended up on GQ.
Keanu was in London. I think it was just after he'd made Dracula. He was in Dracula with Gary Oldman.
Was he?
He was the victim, I think. And so he was around for that. And I hung out with him that night. And he had such a good time. He said, "Can I hang out with you and your mates all week?" So we spent a week together. And then later he invited me to go and see him in LA. So when Tim, who was writing on Smash Hits, knew that Keanu Reeves was in town, and then he said, I don't know whether I just told him on the way to watch Leeds United play, but he said, "Oh, please, can you?" I had photographs of me and the band I was hanging around with, and Keanu and his mate Rob jamming. It was round here near where we were recording this. It was a rehearsal room on the Old Kent Road. So Sim wrote an article about Keanu's week, and then a while after that, I thought, well, Tim likes foot leads and he likes the jam and he understands sort of mainstream things, because what usually happened was, and this still happened for years after, people would try and do cool, small, almost elitist type projects. But what I'd learned at the NME in 4 or 5 years, Alan and I and the rest of the team, we put on 60% increase in weekly sales, which I didn't even realise till a few years ago, and actually worked out the maths on it. Phenomenal in publishing. And so I knew that this magazine that I had a chance to do, it would be a fuck of a lot better if it was successful. And then, because I was on the verge of taking up Ione Sky's mum's offer to go and live in their pool house, and I'd have probably done Grand Royale with them, with the Beasties. And so that was sort of the origination of it. And then I knew John Wilde because he'd interviewed the band, and I'd spent this insane night with him and Andrew Luke Oldham in a hotel off Sloane Square. He was the original Rolling Stones manager and kind of mogul.
I had a night out with him in Bogota.
Yeah, Andrew's a great character and an important person in music. And John had written an amazing story about that in The Independent. And I thought, I knew John from Sounds as well and Zigzag, but that article was so good. And that was really very similar to your articles later and Trevor Ward's and the sort of typical, the loaded article that you defined. But that was, and so I got John, and I knew Mick Bunnage because he wrote tiny little bits at the back of Arena that were really funny.
Mick Bunnage, I think, just brought us like a lot of the humour, a lot of the mad.
Yeah, and I knew Mick was
from Mick, Dr. Mick. Now, of course, does Modern Toss with John
yeah,
Mick.
He's stopped actually now. It's just John now.
Is that right?
Yeah, but but Mick, I knew he was a friend of mine, and I knew Mick because he used to be in a band called Deep Freeze Mice with a guy called Alan, and Alan used to do cartoons for my fanzine Attack on Bazag. So all of these people were kicking around, and then people like you, Christian as he was then, Rowan Chernin, either arrived or I was told about.
So I think probably me and Kirsten, as she is now, Christian was then, were probably the only people who came through like a traditional applying for an advert, right? Is that be right? Of the early original team.
Yeah, there were a few other people interviewed, but they didn't.
Everyone else came from your circle.
Yeah, they were from people. And I've actually got a photograph of my birthday the year before Loaded started. And there's lots of people that ended up on Loaded but didn't know each other then, all in the same room.
Funny.
Which was quite like Miranda Sawyer and Mick Bunnage and Tim Southwell. But you're right, going back to your original point, I always thought a magazine is based upon, the success of a magazine is based upon the relationship between the people that create it and the people that read it.
Yeah.
And that there should be no barriers between those people. And I could never, even though my ego is easily inflated and my self-obsession is huge, that's part of what made me a success. But in The Guardian, when they did a big feature about my book coming out, and in Animal House, they said the journalist said he is surprisingly generous about the input of his staff.
No, I think you are in Animal House.
No, but I don't think.
I wouldn't say surprising, but you're very generous about it.
Yeah, but I was always. I loved it.
Yeah. No, you were the leader.
I put a good team
of a
together.
Gang of street urchins in my mind at the time. You were like Oliver Reed in Oliver. You know, you were the lead at Sykes, or what was his name, Bill Sykes.
He was a thief.
Well, so were you. But we all were. We were all in it for the free clothes. I've still got free clothes now, 30 years later. I've still got thermal underwear on a cold morning.
I think
that we blagged 30
years ago. You know what?
Ago.
I think so then the team, it was like I said, what you said about Stuart Maconie. I could see that he had a really good way of writing, but I didn't write his articles. I just shepherded him into the enemy. I made sure he got commissions. And then, you know, I'd be talking to Alan about him and Sarah Champion and Barbara and, you know, later other writers like Andrew Collins and Roger Morton. And then said, I wanted to try and get a new generation of writers into the enemy. So then when he said, create your own magazine, it was like, great. And then, but yeah, you answered an advert and Christian answered an advert. Rowan was recommended to me by the singer in the band I'd been managing but Rowan was an ad sales guy on ID, and Beth, who was our fashion editor, who was recommended to me by Gillian, who was the head of press at Paul Smith. Rowan had never written, but Steve, when I joined Sounds, I'd obviously never had any formal writing, and then when Lamac joined Enemy, his writing wasn't much cop. So in the same way as people had sat down with me at Sounds, I sat down with Steve, and so I'd been subject to that, and I'd done it with Steve. So I knew that with Rowan, the important thing was where we were in the country at the time. Nightlife was still exploding. There were clubs going off all over the different places from, you know, Newquay to Newcastle, and it was important to cover that. And I wanted somebody who went to a lot of clubs. And Simon, who was the singer in the band, he said, there's this kid at ID. He's not a writer, but he's always out at everything I ever go to. Every nightclub he's there. So Rowan doesn't get much credit, but I think one of the really big things that was different about Loaded was we understood about what was going on in the nightlife. If you bought GQ or Ravina or Esquire.
When you said a minute ago about the no connection, about connection between readers and the stuff. To me, that was key at the time, because before Loaded, I was living in a squat in Hackney, and I'd see, because I wanted to be a writer, so I'd see things like Arena, GQ, and things like that. And it was just, even though I'm living in Hackney, which is like, 4 miles from Soho, I didn't go out in Soho at the time. World. Because, exactly. Literally, I was working shifts on porn mags and TV mags.
Nothing changed.
It was a great training. But
you'd
read
like
these magazines, and it just didn't have any connection to my life at all.
No,
it was things I couldn't afford. It was pairs of trousers that I would never wear.
But funnily enough,
and there was no magazine for people like us. And even when Loaded started, when I finally moved into a flat in Camden, I still felt completely alienated from the media.
It wasn't our world; it was the advertisers' world.
Yeah,
as they still are. Those magazines
and
still are.
And there was that
myth
of the perfection of the writer. The writers never admitted they didn't know things. They were fallible. They'd fucked up. I mean, that carried on. Dylan Jones, who was also a big influence in my life later on, he kept up. He is the sort of founder of that kind of journalism, I think. I went to GQ and I wrote a feature saying I didn't know anything about the story I was about to do. So I'm on the plane reading all the cuttings. And he immediately said to me, never, ever, ever tell the reader you don't know stuff. And I was like, do you know where I come from? I've just done 5 years on Loaded magazine.
Yeah, well, that's why his magazines never sold up many copies. Sold anything. Because people like to see themselves in the writers.
They could be it.
But, one of the great things about social media is you see loads and loads of accounts of people fucking up in one way or another, and they're incredibly funny. Like, I remember reading a story on Instagram about a guy he was serving shots in an Irish bar, and he managed to get the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary of Ireland blind drunk or something, not knowing who he was, and just hanging out with this guy. And so when people ask me, where would Loaded be nowadays? It's all over the press, and people can fly up a flag of drunken roguish behaviour and stick it all over their Instagram, and it's everywhere.
Yeah, for a while Vice wasn't it, before it disappeared? Vice was doing a similar thing online for a while, and then it got much more serious. Yeah. And then was a Lad Bible. I look at them sometimes, go, bloody hell, they've made absolutely millions.
Vice,
that kind of was Loaded online.
No, but you're right.
We were just too early. I mean,
You're right about Vice, because I kept waiting and waiting and waiting for years for somebody to appear who would impress me. And then this kid showed up in my office one day called Andy Capper, and he wanted to bring Vice to Britain. And one of the this is when I had my own company. We published Viz and Jack and Hot Dog and magazines like that. One of my staff, Will Watt, kept saying, let's get this mag. And I should have listened to him, but I'd seen Vice in America in the skateboard shop in New York, probably when we were there with Loaded, the really early Vice. And my initial take was it was a bit snary. It was sort of laughing at people and poking fun at them. And we'd never done that at Loaded. Never. Loaded was always a very positive situation.
I always think one of the most refreshing things very early on, because I'd written for other men's mags, the Details in New York, that was a very good magazine.
That was the only one that I liked.
And For Him I'd written for in London, which became FHM, which wasn't so great. But there was that, I was working for City Limits, London Listings magazine. There was that thing at the time that the counterculture, the lefty kind of people like us, it was very easy to write knocking copy. That was the easiest thing.
Snaring.
And you said early on, which I totally agreed with, that, and that carried on for years.
Guardian
Look at restaurant
like
reviews still like now. What is the point in reviewing something if you don't like it? And you said very early on, if you go to something and it's crap, just don't write about it. And it's because people find it much easier to be funny in a negative way.
That was a reaction to the culture that I'd left at the Enemy. And years later, I knew I'd made the right decision to leave the Enemy because I read a singles column that I wrote, and it was full of that sort of attitude. I didn't recognise myself anywhere. And I was just bored of it. I was tired of doing it. And it must have been rubbish if you think, great, I've got a review in the single, and it was just me or whoever else sneering at it. So that was, in a way, it was like, I wanted it to be like my fanzine, just be enthusiastic about things.
So do you think there was something in the air at the time? Because you're right, that's a very dramatic change. The Enemy was kind of famous for being quite snary. All the music press was. But yet, the 90s, I don't think, didn't start in 1990. It's like the 60s didn't start in 1960. The 90s started in like 92, 93. And within a couple of years, the whole culture was very positive. It was all about
definitely
possibility, going out and just absolutely unapologetically having the best fun.
Yes.
What was in the water, do you think, that made that decade? Vodka, mainly.
Now, what was in the air for me personally was weed.
That's funny in the
that really relaxed me.
Everyone remembers, there was so much cocaine in the 90s. You and I used to laugh so much smoking hash at a little tin
No, not
cans.
hash. I couldn't smoke hash because I never smoked tobacco. But when you met me, if you thought I was intense and mood swingy then, you should have seen me at the NME because my mum was really ill. So sometimes I'd be sitting at the NME office, editing like Sean O'Hagan's interview with Bono or somebody. And I'd get a call to say, your mum's in hospital. She jumped out of the window at the top of her house. And, I was 23 or something when this was going on. And then she took an overdose when I was 26 and died. So, but what had happened for me was, this isn't name dropping. It's probably far bigger. It is far bigger in my life than it is in theirs. But I was spending a lot of time with Mike Diamond in Los Angeles when I'd go over there, and he had this stuff called the government grass that he insisted was being made by the government to keep everyone mellow. Which, obviously that had been done before with heroin in New York. And
this is your Beastie Boys era, hanging out with
so
stoned,
and I loved it. I was really relaxed and. I don't know if this is common, but a well-known English piano player also used to smoke neat grass.
Elton John?
Not Elton John. More from the punk era. So he's a big TV presenter now, but I was at his house. It doesn't fucking matter. It's Jools Holland.
No, I know.
So Jools liked smoking grass neat as well.
Yeah.
And I can remember being at his house once with Vic and Bob, and I said to him, "Can you play Hound Dog backwards?" And he spun round and started playing it with his back to the piano. I said, no,
backwards,
end to beginning.
No.
And he did.
I bet he could. Yeah.
He sat for about a minute and he worked out, wasn't he? Played it. So what I found, it was brilliant. And what I found for me was smoking grass, just neat, because the tobacco would have messed my chest up because I've got asthma, it mellowed me out. And then your other point about what was in the water or I think one of my favourite bits that I wrote in Animal House was where I compared 1984 to 1994. And I did that quite near the end of it, because if you go to 1984, the most obvious image was of the mounted policeman clubbing somebody on a picket line in Orgreave, although, it was seen as a battle. And yet, if you go 10 years on from that, there'd been an explosion of comedy with people like Vic and Bob, David Baddiel, Rob Newman, Jack D, Jerry Sadowitz, just all who became loaded cover stars, Jenny Eclair, Joe Brown. There were loads of brilliant, comedians that emerged. Same in art with Damien Hirst and the Chapman brothers and Sarah Lucas and, Tracy Emin and so on. And the Wilson sisters. There was all of this emergence of largely comprehensive school kids who had had nothing when they left school in their mid-80s. No, it wasn't like they had trust funds. They didn't have like daddy's big house in the Caribbean to go and live in. And they were like, there was no job opportunities when I left school in 84, 83. And so they generated their own direction and momentum. And that came to fruition 10 years later. Ecstasy, the importation of ecstasy from Holland and the emergence of Balearic beats and acid house, that was a big thing because that was much far more far-reaching than punk was because it was a mass movement. Yeah. But that was like a counterculture, an anti-establishment situation where people were just doing what the fuck they wanted. And out of that, lots of record labels, lots of fashion labels, lots of publishing, situations emerged, promoters. And so it was just a period when there were a lot of people like me who had focused on what they wanted to do, were just getting bigger and better at it. And Irving Welsh, who you've had on here, would be another great example of, exactly that sort of thing. And a lot of us, our paths had crossed on the underground. I don't mean on the tube, but on, just in our world, in clubs or raves or festivals or, in people's offices. So the first person who told me about Irving Welsh was a guy called Jeff Barrett, who had a record label called Heavenly, which now has Kneecap, but in the past had people like the Manics or Flowered Up. And Jeff was somebody I knew from my fanzine years. He used to put gigs on at Ziggy's in Plymouth. So there was all of this sort of cross-pollination. And in this mag I've got now, Zine Age Kicks, I got loads and loads of visual stuff from that time, like fanzines and flyers, and it's so a lot of those people that emerged in the 90s had known each other on and off. So there was a lot of introductions going on.
I think a lot of it always reminds me, it's like a blossoming, like the 1960s was, and in relation to the 1950s, that in the 1980s,
exactly the same.
The 1980s was a time of, to me, it was a time of fear. I think you have the line in the book, I don't know if you said it or I said it, it was a time when Britain was at war with itself. Every night on the news, be the Brixton riots, miners' strike, print work, it was horrible. It was fearful. All the poll tax riots, but also hanging over the top of all that was the Cold War. I mean, literally in the 1980s, it wasn't being dramatic. When you were 16, 17, you thought you were going to get fried at any moment.
I've got that here.
And that's like the 50s. And then the 90s came along, world peace kind of came, economic boom. Like you say, all these flowers could bloom. And it was, I don't think we've seen anything like it since. It'd be great if we could. But then the 2000s were kind of now just the 70s. It all got a bit bloated, a bit Russell Brandy, a bit kind of big, corporate takeover.
But we thought we were going to get blown up
in the 80s. Absolutely.
Wouldn't it be funny?
I was on CND marches like you were.
Well, I'm just looking now for this CND.
Do you remember that BBC documentary called something like "You're All Fucked" or something? Yeah, exactly.
So that was like I was doing on CND marches and rock.
I was a member of the Communist Party mainly for that reason. I mean, ridiculous. But
would it be ironic if we got killed now by nuclear war?
Hilarious.
like all the things we feared when we were teenagers, it was because of things like Threads.
What was Threads?
Wasn't it called Threads?
That what I'm thinking of, the drama series.
Yeah, it was a terrifying drama.
Yeah, horrible. And there was that document, there was the public information film that had been banned, but they released it in the 80s, when it was literally telling you, telling you to put a door against the wall of your living room. Get your family under there. If after a week any of them have died and started to smell, push the body out. If it was fucking unreal.
If that had worked, there wouldn't have been 1/3 people killed in Hiroshima in like 17 minutes if they'd had a fucking door to put underneath.
And the bomb in Hiroshima was like 1/1,000,000th of the power of the weapons they were using then, which are all still around now, of course, but now they're all half broken. So they press the button, it'll blow up in their faces.
Have you been there?
Where?
Hiroshima.
No, never. Have you?
Yeah, it's really depressing.
I've never been to Japan.
It's the only museum I've ever been in. Not a museum like the Peace Centre. It's the only place I've ever been where there have been hundreds and hundreds of school children. Like if you went to the Victoria and Albert Museum or the Museum of Football in Manchester or the Train Museum in York or whatever, and you'd see like 50 kids. They'd all be chattering. So it's the only place I've ever been with hundreds of children. And it's absolutely silent because it's so shocking what you're looking at. Anyway, gone.
Well, that's a bit of a downer. And now a word from our sponsor. Like a lot of us who lived through the 90s, I tried to keep my drinking in check. I've had my sober stretches and my less sober ones. One thing that helps is alcohol-free beer. But let's be honest, if there's one thing wrong with alcohol-free beer, there's no buzz. That's where On Beer comes in. It's a non-alcoholic beer packed with botanicals and herbs designed to give you what the makers call a feel-good lift. They say a bottle or two feels like you're just tucking into your second pint. And in my experience, they're not far wrong. I was drinking On Beer before they sponsored my podcast. In fact, I was the one who approached them. So if you want to try something new that gives you a bit of a buzz, take On Beer out for a spin and use this discount code, Martin15, to get a buzzing 15% off. Stay sober. And if you can't stay sober, stay buzzy. I thought there's a bit in your book as well I liked, which I'd never heard before. It's your 3 guiding principles, which I'd never heard in the 90s, which was what always have a beatbox in your dressing room.
This wasn't the 90s. This was for loaded. These were my rules.
For loaded. Well, you should have told the staff. We had no idea.
I did tell you that you were too.
I thought you said
excitable.
I thought you always said always have a bottle in your.
No, these were. I can tell you what these are. Joe Strummer said always have a beatbox in the dressing room, so that stayed in my mind. Bill Drummond, who I'd been to Sweden with to try and find ABBA for the Justified Engines movement. The car broke down, and he said, "You've always got to just be aware of what the situation is. Understand
know
the
limits of the situation."
Pardon?
I've read it more recently than you. Know the limits of the situation.
Yeah, but what that
which
meant,
I only learnt when I got sent to prison in Ireland. That's when I learned that one.
The thing is, the reason he was talking about that was. So everybody knows the KLF, but their first name, originally KLF, Copyright Liberation Front, was their record label. And they were called the Justified Ancients and Mumu or the Jams. They just changed the name on the sleeve. It was exactly the same people. But the car broken down. Bill went to, in a tiny town in Sweden, Bill went to bed and Jimmy Courtney and I walked around the town in about 5 minutes. We spent about 15 minutes looking at the bra shop. And then we went to the station and hung out with the teenagers drinking cider. And it was like we had a great time. But Bill felt that we were looking for something that wasn't there. But we had the best possible time with what was available. And then the third one was Hunter Thompson, Be the Story, which you excelled at.
That was my guiding principle, yeah. If the story isn't happening, get drunk and make it happen. That was my abiding.
But do you know what? I'd never heard this before. So last week I was doing the Rock's Back Pages podcast, and our colleague Derek Ridgers, who was a very sort of laconic 6'4" photographer, looks like Chewbacca.
Reasonable.
Yeah, he talks in a very deadpan way.
But has seen the most amazing thing.
I don't know if this was on the actual podcast or whether it was off the air, but he said to Barney Hoskins, the host, that he was really unimpressed by your behaviour in Cannes.
Have you
and
not
that
heard
he told you off for being unprofessional.
You don't know that? I think it might be in the documentary. Yeah, so in Cannes, which is my big, that's where I set up my stall, got sent to the Cannes Film Festival, had no access to anything, to cut a long story short, just eventually blagged my way into the William Morris party where Harvey Weinstein was and Dolph Lundgren and
Bruce Willis.
Bruce Willis I ended up talking to, and Lennox Lewis. So I got in there and it was, literally a pauper.
Was Derek with you?
Derek, yes, he sort of followed. He was like, "It's not going to work. It's not going to work." I'm like, "Look, I've got the fucking invitation of Lloyd Kaufman, the head of Troma Films, who I knew their films really well, and I impressed him so much. He gave me his pass. Who is like 5'2" and very Jewish looking. I look like an Aryan U-boat commander at that age, but I pretend to be him. Get into the party, and I walked in. I was like, literally, the room is just full of film stars. Terence Stamp. Well, I thought Terence Stamp was someone I knew from England. I just saw the face, and I go, "What are you doing here?" And he goes, "I'm here promoting Priscilla, Queen of the Desert." which is like his big comeback movie. And I talked to him for a second. He looked me straight in the eye. And he's famously did lots of gangster films in the 70s and 60s.
I used to like his...
He looked me straight in the eye and goes, I don't want to talk to you anymore, and walks off. So I walk up to the bar. It's the first time I've ever seen an open bar in my life. And I walk
free
up. Free bar.
Yeah.
And I said, I'll have 2 glasses of champagne, large whiskey, gin and tonic and a brandy. Derek, what do you want? And Derek was unimpressed with that. I drank all that lot to give myself the courage to walk up to people like, just big stars, walking up, hi, it's Martin from Loaded magazine. Got a great story. Then we got thrown out, obviously. And then as we walked away, we walked down the front and Derek goes, I'm not very impressed by people who get drunk when they're meant to be working. And I was so drunk. I was, I know, neither am I. I'm not impressed. I didn't realise he meant me. And that was my big opening feature. So who was right in the long run, Derek?
I mean, you've just read this, so it's fresh in your mind. But because of the success of Loaded, not many people ever asked me about the success that I had on Enemy, and it was a brilliant time. I could have, in fact, now if you could wave a magic wand and go back to any job I'd ever had, that's the one I'd go back to.
I thought you should have made more of that in your book, to be honest.
What about the Enemy?
Yeah, I thought those early years were. I mean, you're very good on the fanzine scene. I just thought you went through that quite quick.
Yeah, I was rushing.
Perhaps I didn't know that bit. I found that fascinating.
I'm gonna write another book about places I've been. And so there's all of the stories that I went on in me, but I worked a lot with Derek Richards in America, and some of the places he took me to in California, because he was really on the scarification and the sort of S&M subculture, taking photographs.
He took me to a place called the Vault in New York, and I'm still a bit scarred.
Exactly. Nowadays, you can't walk through London without seeing somebody covered in tattoos and metal all over their face, but in 1988, when we'd be in, Jumbo's Clown Room, which was a strip joint that Courtney Love used to strip in LA, he would take me to places like that. I was like 23 years old. And the guys with guns and stuff, pulling them out. The guy showed up even at Loaded. One of Derek's friends' boyfriend showed up at the Chateau Marmont, waving a fucking gun around. There were people pulling knives out. They were like... It was just, Derek knew some very, very strange people, but to be fair to him, he was always sober.
He was always sober.
Yeah, he was always sober. And a lot of the time I was, because I was so focused at that point on wanting to become a really good writer.
You were sober then, yeah, not by the time I met you. You were never
I wasn't totally sober, but what I mean is I didn't need to be drunk on my Enemy years to do stupid stuff. I was driving a car around LA without even having a driving license.
On Loaded, because at Loaded you were seldom seen without a bottle of brandy in your hand. Why did we?
No, actually it's not true, because I threw up all over Alan Lewis's desk and I punched a news editor and I chinned Alan McGee. I used to drink a lot of the Enemy. But what I meant was, when I was on a job with Derek,
right, I
loved the concept, which you and probably, I would say, Bill Burroughs, who was another Loaded writer. You were probably the 2 best long-form features writers, and
I'll go along with that.
And could really grasp the energy of a story and explain it to the readers in a way that made it feel like they were there with you. And that's what I wanted to be like. And in actual fact, whilst I've been doing this new magazine, Zine Age Kicks, I reread an interview that I had done with Joe Strummer, and I read the introduction. Somebody put it online when I was working on this. The people that do Mick Jones's Rock and Roll Public Library, they put a clip of this interview up, and I said, "Can you send me the rest of that?" And they sent and I reread it, and it was like, I was fucking a good writer when I was in my, like, at the end of Sounds. I seriously wanted to be as good as George Plimpton and Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe. That's what I wanted. Yeah. I don't mean I wanted to be like them. Yeah. I wanted to be as good as
I think we were all trying to be that
but what happened was,
generation of writers.
But what happened for me was, I knew bands that were coming through, and I knew writers that were coming through, and I was able to get interviews with well-known people. I hadn't spoken to the Enemy for a long time, like Robert Smith, for instance. So they promoted me. So even though I kept writing, I wrote over 50 cover stories when the 4 or 5 years I was at the Enemy, but I wasn't like someone like Stuart Maconie was never making any decisions about the content of the Enemy.
Yeah.
Barbara Ellen wasn't. And so it meant that I spent more time behind my desk, although other people would say otherwise, than I would have done. And I was about to move. I found a postcard to my mum. I was about to move to New York. And I found this postcard saying, I'm going to move to New York. I'm going to set up an NME office here. And I was thinking, why didn't I do that? Because that's what I really wanted to do. And then I remembered Alan promoted me. And if you're the features editor or the assistant editor, as I became after that, you've got to be in there. You've got to be in the meetings. You've got to make the decisions about, what are the next 4 covers going to be and how they're going to complement each other and how they're going to work and who's going to write it, who's going to photograph it.
Well, isn't that what they say? You always get promoted
to the position
that's actually
good
quite
writer.
boring. Exactly. You because you're good. So I eventually ended up being managing editor of 5 magazines, and I hated it. Absolutely hated it, because all you're doing was dealing with staffing disputes, like you said, planning covers, talking to advertisers. If you stayed a writer, you'd probably be dead by now. But
do you know why I don't have any? I didn't really make any money out of Loaded compared to
none of us did
contemporaries that had come up with similar ideas.
I get people come up to me and go, God, you must be all right. I go, why? I was on 16 grand a year till the end.
No, I am okay, because I was clever with when I did make some money later.
Made some money later, yeah.
But we
weren't in it for the money.
No, but the fact that the what was I going to say then about the?
Can I tell you my Derek Ridges story quickly while you think about it? So Derek,
let's not spend the whole thing talking about Derek. But you should interview him, because he's becoming really respected as his underground photographs now.
Yeah.
He always was a good photographer. He's getting respected for his own personal work rather than his commissioned work. Anyway, the point I was trying to make was about writing. Loaded had brilliant writing, but I found this article about Joe Strummer, and I read the introduction. I thought, I was fucking ace then. And then I read this was when I was doing Animal House as well. And then I read my articles in the NME, and I had to ring one of the subs who I'm still in contact with, Len Brown. I said, Len, why was nobody editing me at NME like Tony Stewart was at Sounds? Some of this is just fucking insane rubbish. And he said, well, no, it's not. You're being hard on yourself. He said, but basically the paper was not in a good place. We were all older, unstayed, and you just exploded in like a load of energy and noise, and the bands you were writing about were making it. So everybody just said, just fucking leave him to get on with it. But my writing was better at the end of Sounds than when I read my cover stories with people like New Order or whoever in NME in the same year, even, just simply because there wasn't an editor kind of shaping and helping.
Everyone needs a good editor, but I mean, Loaded the editing. You were the only person really.
I'm dodging a deadline now from our friend Bridget Harrison. I said, I'm going to come past your office at the Times to see Martin Deeson. I'll have the new magazine. I'll drop one in. She said, I don't want to see you before you finish this copy. But she was editing last night on a Google Doc. And she said, look, I said, it's okay, Bridget, I don't mind you doing this. I've done this to many, many writers. She said, it's only a few little changes. It's fucking covered in changes. But it's constructive. And I think if you're lucky enough to work with an editor who understands what a good story is, then you're going to become a better writer. And I was lucky at Loaded. You were a really good writer. Tim was, because of his smash hits thing, had a real good energy about his writing. Bill Burroughs Bill could have been I think a really important book writer of his time, or Bill probably should have gone to America and written for some of the big magazines, like a few of the other editors.
What's his name who came after us, who went to LA and did very well. I can't remember his name, but I always thought I should have done that as well. Should have gone and started writing for Rolling Stone and these big, the huge, because the circulation's much bigger over there. The budgets are huge.
Yeah.
But then I disappeared into kind of post-Loaded addiction and stuff like that. Let's touch on that briefly as well. Someone talk about the legacy of Loaded in terms of nationally. Is there one at all? I think all I can say is I always like that expression, we added to the gaiety of nations. It just made the 90s a lot more fun. You can argue about what happened in the 2000s and, Gail Porter and all that stuff, but also the personal legacies as well, because I know that's something you're obviously close to your heart because you've been sober for 25 years.
No.
It's only now.
28 now.
Well, nearly. It's only now I can look at it, and it is amazing to think that not only were we doing it, we were celebrating it, writing about it every day. The publishers knew all about it. I don't think it occurred to anyone that doing coke for breakfast and starting drinking at 11 every day would eventually have a physical and an emotional and a mental.
I had one glimpse of it.
Problem. No one said to us, "Be careful."
I had I had a few people say to me, but all of them were people who were much bigger in the world than me. So one was Sir Paul Smith, and he talked to me about it, and he referred to his friend. He said, "My friend Eric has stopped taking drugs," and he said if people offer him something, he said, "No, he's okay." Rather than going into it, he would say, "Okay, it's okay. I've got my own," or whatever. He had kind of. I guess that Eric was Eric Clapton, because I think they were neighbours,
right?
And then Damien Hirst said to me once at the Met Bar, "I'll talk to you about this when you're sober." And then Frank Skinner as well at a screening of something, a recording of some show. He turned to me afterwards and he said, "James, every story you tell is about you being drunk." And I didn't know that Frank had been long-term sober at that point.
Yes, yeah.
So those three things stuck out. And then something that changed, I do remember crawling around the living room floor after I'd moved to GQ, but before I'd got clean. And I do remember thinking, we weren't having any plans to have any, I'd only just bought a house. I wasn't planning to have a kid, but I do remember thinking, I could never have a kid if I was like this. And then Tony Adams's book was Addicted, I think it was called. Addicted. That was such an unusual book because it was so honest. And
a public figure coming out about the degradation of it.
Yeah, but Tony Adams was England captain and he was driving drunk, smashed into a lamppost, went to jail for a year and then came back and won the league with Arsenal and talked about getting sober. So that, I found that, I don't support Arsenal by any means, but I did remember thinking that book, and I can't remember whether I read it after I was sober or I think maybe after I was sober, but that really that was one of the few things at the time, because as you say, it wasn't just the media world and the loaded world.
No.
There was loads. There was a generation of people who'd probably started taking drugs with ecstasy and moved on to cocaine. Wow. And you would go into football clubs, not just nightclubs. You'd go into football clubs or restaurants and there'd be signs in the toilet saying, 0 tolerance to any cocaine use.
I remember our mutual friend Howard Marks saying that he went into prison in the States, which I guess would have been like 1988, and cocaine was only done by Eric Clapton, by rock stars, the old school rock stars, not modern music people. And when he came out of prison, I think in 96, he said it was like the bloke who came around to paint his loo. His bathroom was doing.
Howard was great.
I love Howard.
So
I still miss him to this day.
But he very kindly in Mr. Smiley points out that I gave him his first proper job ever. Because
as a columnist,
you and I had been out with Mark, who was the number 2 at Stringfellows, and he'd been was he called Mark Young? I think.
Yeah, ex-Flying Squad. Yeah,
you would think of Stringfellows as being like sort of a den of depravity, but this guy was an ex-cop.
Do you remember we had the drinking contest with Peter Stringfellow?
Yeah, God almighty.
And
Peter Stringfellow loved the... but that was going to say, but there was a weird time before Stringfellow got his lap dancing license.
Yes, that was
when he started.
Dancing, right?
No, but he, Smashing, which was the best nightclub in London, was there for a bit.
Yeah, that was cool.
And they were letting anyone in, basically. Yeah. You didn't have to be in Coronation Street or a city boy to get in the Stringfellows anymore. You went out with somebody there, so we spent a bit of time there. But Mark had told us about this guy that when he was in the police, they'd done this big trap to get him coming off a beach on a yacht with some.
Was this Howard?
Yeah, to get Howard Marks. That was the first time I heard of Howard Marks. And then Steve Pike, who was a loaded photographer who I'd worked with on The Enemy, he ran me up and he said, "I've just taken the front cover shot for this guy's book. He's an Oxford graduate, Welsh guy. The book's amazing. He'd be perfect for loaded." And then did you go?
So me and Steve went to Palma. He'd been out of prison for like 6 months, if that, after 7 years. We spent the weekend staying at Howard's house, had an amazing time. Ended up, because I was in the midst of all that stuff, I said, "Do you know anywhere we can get some coke?" And of course he did, because it's Palma, Mallorca. So we went out, and he was like, "I've never tried this before." The funniest thing is, he said, you gave me my first ever line of coke. And we ended up doing it on Robert Graves' grave. I've since met about 6 people who he said that to. And I met someone who he said he gave me the first
He said it to me after
there you go.
He said it to me after, at the end of 19 97, the first Christmas for you and I were at GQ.
Yeah. You love telling people that.
Yeah, he said I'd never taken cocaine before.
But
it was bizarre.
Talking actually, we were talking about the dangers. I just want to remind myself, because it's in your book and you write about it very
interestingly. Why he said that?
That's when we were at GQ, there was this famous day when you ended up throwing, which is a long story, which is covered brilliantly, but when you ended up throwing a bottle of champagne at me and Barbara Ellen, it hit the desk, flew out the window, smashed out the window, and this was a huge problem at GQ because we'd only been there 6 weeks or 2 months or something. And they called both of us in and said, I think we were in the same room together, and Peter Stewart, and the head, Susanna Amore, the head of HR, wasn't even called HR then, personnel, looked at both of us and said, do you want to go into rehab?
No, she said, you need help with
I'd never heard anything more ridiculous in my life.
She said, I was so offended. She said, I was sitting in the middle, you on the left, Peter Stewart was on the right, like 3 naughty schoolboys, because I'd thrown this bottle through a window, a smashed window, and it'd gone through a car windscreen. And
it's all pretty bad.
That was really...
And I was shocked. That was the
really
first time
mad.
I thought I might have a problem.
It was a mad...
And you just went, yes. And I looked at you, I was like, what?
It was insane.
And that's when you started the process of...
So she said, she had the 3 of us, we were getting a bollocking, and then she said, do you need help? And it was very funny because you two in unison said no, and at the same time I said yes.
It was moving that you said yes in a way, because we're running out of time. But all the whole thing about your mum is very important in the book, and that vulnerability. But you never let that through to anyone at the time. Yes, you did need help. We all needed help.
No, nobody knew.
I had no idea when we were loaded that your mum had her sudden death at her own hand. I heard some rumours, I think it must be 7 or 8, my mum died 7 or 8 years before Loaded, but it was actually like 18 months before, or 9 months before. It was incredible. So you were you were the leader, which is another question I was going to ask you as well, because you very kindly say in the book that I was the funniest travelling companion you could ever have, when you and I had such fun all over the world. I've never laughed so much. Is it a function? Now we haven't seen each other for 5 years. Is it a function of being the leader that you had to keep everything, your problems bottled in, but also that, I don't know, do you hang out with other people?
I wasn't sitting in my office at Loaded surrounded by breakfast cereal and free T-shirts and trainers and vodka bottles everywhere, worrying about what happened to my mum. The moment she died, the moment she died, it felt like a balloon drifting away. It was like a pressure drop.
You don't think you were acting out in the sense that some of your crazy behaviour was part of grief?
But what happened was, underneath there was this fucking huge fault line running through me. And so this is something I became aware of, I wasn't comfortable with, which I didn't have any control over, that... I could have been sitting, say, with you and having a real good laugh, talking about a story or an incident that happened or something. And then if you'd gone out of the room and I got a phone call or something like this, somebody at the company had said something that annoyed me, like, can we give something stupid away on the front cover or whatever, if there's something that had kind of triggered me a bit, the next person who'd walked in, who'd probably heard us laughing, I'd be a real fucking cunt to them. And my mood swings, I didn't really understand what was going on. I knew it wasn't good. I didn't have any control over it. So that's what was going on. And it was only later when I went into sort of a rehab relationship with a therapist that I came to understand the phrase that you're changing the way you feel. So I said this last week, that when it was really difficult was when my mum was ill. Yeah. And then when she died, obviously I was absolutely devastated. But Loaded became like the thing that took my mind away from it. Mm. And because I'd ramped up, because when I wasn't working at the NME, I left the NME at the end of 91. I was still writing for them through till like September 9, or the summer of... 91, anyway, I was still writing them for a bit after I'd gone, but my aim was to go and live in LA. I was writing from Los Angeles. I was spending quite a lot of time there. Anytime there was a band that I knew, go in there, I'd go with them, like the Wonder Stuff or the Cult who lived there, or I went with the Pixies. I did some stories with the Beasties out there. So I was spending my time there. And then when Loaded exploded, But even in the development period of Loaded, I was doing things like I went round the world with U2 for the Sunday Times, and I was writing for Sunday Times. I was still managing my mate's band, having good fun. Loaded exploded, and there wasn't really any space for introspective consideration.
No, but I do think, honestly, you were a bit like a walking nervous breakdown at the time as well. But you may have been too close to see it. I mean, there was explosions of violence.
Well, no, when I went to GQ, I think
you were clearly in a kind of breaking down type situation, as well as having huge success at the same time.
No, I never thought I was breaking down. But when we went to GQ, when I did the book, for Enemy, probably one of Animal House, I probably spoke to about 3 or 4 people. So I spoke to Adrian Thrills, who was one of the people that helped me get onto the Enemy, and I spoke to Len, and I spoke to a friend of mine called Sarah Lavelle, who I was friends with at GQ. She worked in a different department. And I said to her, why were all those older ladies at Condé Nast so nice to me, like Susanna Ray Moore and the publisher of Vanity Fair, I forget her name, she was really nice to me, and Bridget, who was a lady that did the catering and all the fancy lunches.
They used to mother you because you were very vulnerable.
And the lady that edited Brides, they were all really, really quite maternal to me. And Sarah said, because you're in such a fucking mess.
You were. We both were, but you were displaying it.
No, but it was clear when I was at GQ that by that point I was in an extreme mess with the drugs and the drink. The slight problem, Martin, was I was really good at what I did. And in those 18 months we were at GQ, I was at GQ with you.
I know.
We put on 60,000 sales. We doubled the newsstand sales.
Yeah, but the trouble was, I think what you did, with all due respect, what you didn't realise was you were very good at that side of it. But the difference between GQ and Loaded was that when you get to GQ, you also have to be good.
Yes.
Frankly,
but it wasn't
having lunch with advertisers, all that kind of stuff.
No, but I've said that in here.
Side of publishing.
I've said that in...
I think that's where, and I know from being there, because I stayed there 10 years after you left, that's what pissed them off about you at the time, that they thought they could mold
it wasn't even a general situation. It was one situation.
Fashion shows in New York?
It was Allure.
Pardon? What's that word?
A fragrance brand, maybe Chanel, had a men's fragrance called Allure, and they'd offered GQ 30 grand to add a new section to Man of the Year, which I'd bought Man of the Year to England from America, and I launched a GQ Man of the Year with Peter Stuart, the publisher, and I said to Peter, I'm not putting Allure. I don't know anyone with Allure. And he said, what about the chap from Blur? I said,
he has Allure.
He hasn't got Allure. I don't know what it is. I said, but if they just said to me, we've got an advertorial page and Chris Sullivan or John Morgan or Martin Deeson are going to write it, and it's going to be about a man with Allure. We've chosen Dave Garn from Depeche Mode or something like that. Then would have been fine. But they gave me the option to give my opinion.
But it was
But I said no. So the moment they lost 30 grand,
of course, it's Condé Nast.
That was the problem.
Saying the Nazis or Rommel was one of the best dressed men.
I didn't say that.
I always think was my idea. I would have somehow got away with that.
Martin, I'd say this now, and in the book I don't. I said I took the fall because of the editor.
Oh, you did, because the page was signed off by Nicholas Coleridge. We can say it.
But also the deputy editor had passed it. And the production editor had it presented to him by
we'd all signed off
by the sub editor, and it went to the deputy editor. The reason I wasn't there was I was in America being interviewed to be the editor of Details by Cy Newhouse,
which was a great magazine,
which nobody knew about and nobody ever knew about. But obviously, the MD of Condé Nast and the CA knew about it. The MD was really hoping I was going.
Yeah, he was desperate to go to you because you didn't. All I'm saying is because you didn't fit
10 days later, I was gone.
Yeah, I remember.
Maybe 2 weeks.
Clearly.
2 weeks later.
Well, have I ever told you this story? I don't know if I've ever told you. So phone call came down. You need a piss. We're finishing now. Phone call came down.
Okay, let's
just tell you
let's not end on me getting fired.
No, it's not. It's a really good story about it. You got fired. The
call
phone came down. You've got to
slow down. Nobody will understand what you're talking about.
Will you come down? Will you please come upstairs to see Nicholas Coleridge? So I went round the office and said goodbye to everyone. I said, well, James has been fired. Clearly, I've been fired as well. I walk upstairs to Nicholas Coleridge's office. He's in there. We have a glass of champagne in his hand. And he passed me a glass of champagne and he goes, oh, it was a marvellous day's light sacking, wasn't it?
What was that?
I knew you'd want to hear it.
What did he say?
It was a marvellous day's light sacking, wasn't it? And it was like...
He hadn't had a marvellous day, Martin.
I was like... I just put the glass down and walked out. I didn't know what to fucking say. I was like...
No, but I'm going to...
My mate's just been...
My lawyer told me never to talk about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. He whacked the MD of Condé Nast around the room. He was an older boy than him at Eton, and I got an enormous payout.
I remember very
And
well.
About 8 months later, the head of Condé Nast's HR rang me up and said, "Can you give us your lawyer's number? Because we need to use him on something."
Anyway.
And I used it, but by the way, I took that payoff and started a company called IFG,
I remember, which
I sold for over £6.5 million. So that was really nice of Nicholas to give me that money.
Listen, we're running out of time, but I didn't want to finish on the end of GQ. But listen.
Let's finish with this.
Animal House is a great read.
Thank you.
Really,
glad
really
you
good.
enjoyed
And
it.
this is the new thing. I'm holding a thing here for the listeners called Zine Age Kicks: Visual Evidence of a Life in Music and Magazines by James Brown, which is a really, really good sort of scrapbook style format of loaded fanzines, music press, gig stuff. Really, really good.
It's got pictures of the gig of the night you mentioned that no one's ever seen with Mark Smith, Shane MacGowan and Nick Cave in my kitchen in Camberwell for the Enemy cover. It's the pictures I took of that day. And after I'd finished the book, I had so many things lying around. I thought, I'm going to do a visual version of it. So this is my dub plate remix of Animal House.
But listen, I want to say thank you. It's really good to see you after so long. I just want to say there were two things in the book I couldn't help correcting, which you got wrong.
You're going to really
correct you? Yeah. One, when I went to Argentina, Howard Marks didn't want me to collect $15,000 from a stranger in the ghetto. It was $1 million. He said, if you go and collect $1 million, you're going to have half of it.
I thought you said it was 15 grand.
To this day, I could have died doing that. And the other one was the Virgin Upper Class big glass sign from the Upper Class Lounge. I do have it.
You know, I took that because I didn't want you to feel like I was liable, even though it was true. You did steal it.
Of course I did. You were there.
I know, but
you
had been getting worried about what I was going to write about with good reason.
No, you wrote some very.
Your behaviour was appalling.
Yeah, and it was only me. It was only me. I blame my boss.
Did you like that bit of writing?
There was a couple of bits. I like that bit, and there was another bit where you said,
when you got Chris Floyd in a headlock, that was
dragged
so
him
funny.
along the floor at JFK Airport, and he just gave up. He just went like people do, sort of like, resigned to being dragged along the floor behind Stephen Fry with his head in his hands. Anyway, you have to buy the book to find out what the fuck me and James are talking about there.
It's
James Brown. It's been an absolute
Thank
pleasure.
you. I've enjoyed catching up with you again.
Good to see you.
What's your name again?
Give us the job. We are proud to be sponsored by On Beer, the only alcohol-free beer scientifically proven to give you a buzz. I drink it, and I like the buzz. Support the show, get 15% off, and keep me in a job. Search On Beer and use the code MARTIN15.